Hey, looks like folks are settling in. Welcome, everyone. Today marks the start of Restorative Justice Month, and we're so excited to kick it off with one of our special issues in this year's webinar series, the topic of restorative justice, neurodiversity, and mental health in the criminal legal system. Today's webinar came directly from suggestions and our attendee feedback, so thank you for that, and we're so grateful to have an opportunity to address these important topics and its intersections. So as we delve into these topics today, we're reminded of the pressing need to rethink conventional approaches to justice. Restorative justice offers a framework that centers healing and accountability, which is especially critical when considering individuals with diverse cognitive, emotional, or psychological needs who too often face harmful and inadequate responses within our systems. So our conversation today really invites us to envision a more accessible and inclusive system, one where each person's humanity is recognized and supported. We have an incredible group of panelists today, all whom in some form or fashion are advancing advocacy, accessibility, and education in restorative justice, neurodiversity, and mental health. By the way, my name is Avery Arrington, and thank you for joining us today. I serve as one of the assistant directors for the National Center on Restorative Justice. And for accessibility purposes, I'll give a brief self-description. I'm a Black woman with dark brown locks, wearing a gray sweater. I have round eyeglass frames, and I'm standing in front of a whiteboard. So before I turn things over today to our moderator, I definitely want to acknowledge our partners at the Bureau of Justice Assistance, our host institution, Vermont Law and Graduate School, our collaborative partners at the University of San Diego and the University of Vermont, for their support and leadership in improving practice and policy in the criminal legal system through restorative justice education and research. I will now turn things over to Miriam Rutenberg, an attorney who worked at the Mental Health Legal Advisors Committee in the state of Massachusetts for more than 17 years, before joining Massachusetts Committee for Public Counsel Services Mental Health Litigation Division. In her work, Miriam has advocated for and represented clients in matters including custody and parenting time, adult guardianship, education rights, medical discrimination, and appropriate mental health care for incarcerated clients. She currently is a candidate for a professional certificate in restorative justice from Vermont Law and Graduate School. So we're happy to have you here, Miriam, as well as all the other panelists. Thank you for taking the time to moderate today's conversation.
Thank you, Avery. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for the introduction. So yes, I have a very long background in mental health, and I'm brand new to restorative justice and super excited to learn from all of our panelists today. I am a white woman with shoulder-length light gray hair. I'm wearing a dark blue jacket, and I'm sitting in front of a red brick wall background. So thanks, Avery, also for the sort of brief fundamentals in restorative justice for this conversation. And before we get started, I'd like to ask the panelists to introduce themselves and answer this initial question in your introduction, which is, what are your values and how do they show up in this work? Zoe, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. Hi, my name is Zoe Collins. I use she, hers pronouns. I am a young white woman with long brown hair, and I have a colorful artwork background behind me. I am autistic, disabled, and chronically ill. And when I introduce myself, I always like to say that I use identity first language. And that really varies person to person. So my quick tip is always listen to what people use to identify themselves and kind of reflect that language back. So that means that I say I'm autistic and not a person with autism. Do you want me to give a little background on who I am? That also?
Sure.
Okay. I have experience in campus activism around sexual assault and Title IX. I also worked as a legal advocate in Baltimore for victims of domestic violence. And then I moved back home to Denver, and I was a case manager and victim advocate for survivors, specifically disabled survivors in Denver, and then I burned out really hard, and I kind of shifted into community education and advocate training. I also I have training in high impact dialogue and circle keeping. And I also like to give my access needs today, which are that because I struggle with blood sugar, I'm going to be snacking. So and stimming because I'm autistic. So kind of with all that, my values, I really value accessibility and slowing down. I also really value fun. Part of my circle keeping work, I do circles on gardening with nature, and that's always one of our core values. And I also really value interdependence and shared learning. So yeah.
Thank you, Zoe. Adobe?
Sure. Hi, I'm Adobe Wabo. I'm a psychiatrist currently at Yale School of Medicine, where I'm an instructor, but also doing the public psychiatry fellowship. I have experience in working in correctional settings, and now I'm sort of working on the other side in the outpatient sort of correctional setting. So that's what I do. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a Black woman with two buns on my head, my hair in two buns, and I'm sitting in front of gold white curtains. My values are connections and authenticity. I am very big on making, when I think about connections, I think about relationships with my friends, my family, with the people I work with, my peers, my colleagues, and my patients. I'm someone who enjoys making connections, no matter how transient they are or how long-term they are. And I also really value authenticity, so I hope to show up always as myself in these connections and in these relationships. So, yeah, that's a little bit about me, and yeah, excited for today.
Thank you. Jasmine? You're on mute, Jasmine?
My name is Jasmine Lamb. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a middle-aged white woman with brown hair that's not quite shoulder length. I'm wearing a brown vest, and I am sitting in an office in Burlington, Vermont, where I work. I also have experience with chronic illness and disability in my own life experience. And I am the president of an organization called Mansfield Hall, and Mansfield Hall offers residential living and learning communities for neurodivergent college students. And we're located in Burlington, Vermont, Madison, Wisconsin, and Eugene, Oregon. And the students, they come and live in our residence hall, but they can attend any of the area colleges. So they might go to the University of Vermont, or to the community college in Eugene, or to the University of Wisconsin or Champlain College, and we serve as their dorm and their kind of home community, where we're providing a lot of academic, social, and living skills support to them while they attend college, and then they will transition off into living on campus. The values that I bring to my life and to my work start with a belief that people will do well if they can, that and also that we have an innate capacity for growth, that is the natural unfolding for us as human beings, as it is for flowers and other living creatures, is to be able to grow and individuate and build our wisdom and capacity. And the way that I believe, the environment that I believe best supports that kind of individuation and personal growth is one of community and interdependence. And so that is really what roots the work that I do at Mansfield Hall and the kind of community we have. We don't talk a lot about building independence. We talk a lot about building the capacity for individuation in the context of interdependence.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that as we go. I do want to back up with a couple of housekeeping things that I missed up at the top. If you would like or benefit from closed captions, they are enabled and you can toggle them on at the bottom of your screen. And the chat is disabled, but we will be having time for questions at the end. So feel free as we go to put your questions in the Q&A box, but I think we're saving them for the end. So thank you all for sharing a little bit about your background and the values that you bring to this work. So Zoe, I'd like to start with if you can give us some definitions of neurodiversity and talk about why it's significant to restorative practices.
Yes, I will try my best here. So the consulting business that I have is SpireMind, and I give presentations about neurodivergence. Usually I work most specifically with victim services, but I also have done some work with like state public defenders and things like that. So yeah, when we're talking about neurodivergence, I feel like the first place we have to start is with disability generally, which is such a huge group. And neurodivergence and mental health fall under that category, at least in my mind. So I like to start with defining disability. And just to kind of ground us in the law, I'll just read the Americans with Disabilities Act definition of disability. They say that disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And major life activities is pretty much anything, right? Like that can be the way you breathe, the way you eat, the way you sleep, the way you move, the way you talk or communicate or think. So that's really broad on purpose. The second part of that definition is a person who has a history or a record of such an impairment. And the third part is a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment, which I think is a really key piece of understanding disability, kind of from a disability justice perspective of thinking about systems and intersectionality and how disability really is also a social construct in a lot of ways too. So also wanted to give a couple statistics that 1 in 4 people, according to the CDC, are disabled. So there's a lot of disabled people out there, and we actually think that number is low. Survivors of intimate partner violence are twice as likely to be disabled, and 60% of incarcerated people have a brain injury. So that kind of gives an idea of like just how common disability is when we're doing work in restorative justice spaces. So neurodiversity and neurodivergence, going kind of deeper into that disability. Neurodiversity is, I like to think about it as the natural human diversity of neurocognitive functioning. And neurocognitive functioning is basically just the way that your brain and your nervous system work. So a lot of people think that neurodivergence is only about things in your brain, but it also has to do with the way that your nervous system works. So things like epilepsy and seizure disorders are often also grouped under that neurodivergence category because your nervous system, the way you move, the way that you respond to stimuli, sensory things, those things are all related to your brain and your nervous system. So that's what neurodiversity is that just huge variation among the population of how those things look for everybody. Another important point, I think, is that one person can't be neurodiverse, right? So like, for example, this panel or even the call with all 163 of you, we are a neurodiverse group, right? Not all of us have the same neurocognitive functioning as each other, so we're diverse. But if you're talking about one person, I am neurodivergent, which to me, I think means something about your experience of neurocognitive functioning diverging from what is typical or expected from neurocognitive functioning. So, and that of course is still like really subjective and can also kind of have some like political groupings as part of that, right? So it's going back to that ADA definition. It can be something that is put onto somebody as well. So I think I'll stop there and let others share as well.
Before asking Jasmine to jump in, can I just make a wonky legal point about the ADA? So it is all the definitions you gave are accurate, and that is people who fall in those categories. It's illegal to discriminate against people based on that. The trick for us, because we're going to be talking a little bit more about accessibility and accommodations in this conversation, is that third prong, being perceived to have a disability. You can't be discriminated against on that basis, but you also can't request a reasonable accommodation for a disability that you don't actually have. So I just want to say that for our future conversation, but thank you. Jasmine, do you want to step in here?
Yeah, I will just, I really appreciated all the different ways you were framing it, Zoe, and your like self-disclosure about how you understand yourself as neurodivergent. So I thought I would do a kind of similar thing about myself, which I think helps to fill out the complexity of social construct with other ways of looking at things. I would say in some settings, I would say I am neurotypical. And I would say that because I can vary at this moment of my life. It's not always been true, but at this moment of my life, I can navigate the social culture that we live in a way that aligns with expected cultural, social, professional behavior. And so on that level, I fit into neurotypical. And a part of that is a recognition of the privilege that in our culture is afforded to somebody who has that capacity. If I am in a different setting with my friends or even my colleagues here, I can see a whole lot of ways that the way that I see the world, my sensory experience in the world, the way I process information is actually not neurotypical. Like it's unusual. And for me at this stage of my life, I see it as a huge gift to how I get to actually be in the world and see the world. And so personally, I do consider myself neurodivergent, but publicly, I consider myself neurotypical because I'm afforded all of the privilege that comes with that. So I wanted to say that. I also just want to say, with the broader topic of disability, that one of the things that's really interesting about disability and disability identity is that almost every human being will be disabled at some point in their life. So this is there. I witness, because of the kind of community I hold, I witness interactions and dialogues with parents and with people on college campuses and in the community where they perceive the community that I am part of as being kind of like fundamentally different from them in different kinds of ways. And I think there's a big misunderstanding in people not really recognizing that actually all of us are going to most likely be disabled at some part of our life, and that is a very normal and necessary and expected part of the life experience. We're going to have an accident that's going to leave us impaired cognitively or physically. We're going to get older and have less abilities of different kinds. I mean, I could go on. The list is endless. So I just wanted to say those pieces. And then I also just wanted to speak briefly to the kind of second part of this question, which is about sort of why is neurodiversity significant to restorative practice? And I mean, partly I would say if people are out there and they're wanting to practice restorative justice, then they're going to be working with people. And as Zoe just said, at any one time, at least a quarter of the population is disabled, and that might be defined as neurodivergent or a different kind of disability, but this is just part of the human experience. And so it's really important to have some grounding in what that might look like and what people might bring from that perspective to just support you to better hold circle, hold community, hold process for any group of human beings. And restorative practice is an incredible entry point into learning more about people and people learning more about each other so that we can build communities that have more capacity overall and more capacity to stay intact and more resilience.
Before I ask Adobe to talk about mental health and maybe give some definitions, I am just gonna lift up one question right now in the Q&A because it's, I think, directly related to what Zoe and Jasmine have just been talking about. And the question is, are you saying being, quote, neurotypical is subjective depending on situational context?
I think, at least for me, I think yes, mostly. I talk about sometimes like neurotypical is really fluid. I appreciate how Jasmine was speaking about just neurocognitive functioning in general is really fluid, right? Like I can be just depending on the day, my experience in my body and in my brain can be really different. So like that's just a point of like, even if you're witnessing one person for an hour during a panel, that doesn't necessarily tell you about how they are in different situations. Like for me, like I live with my family and my parents because I need a lot of support. Even though I can like be presenting like this, that doesn't mean that I don't also really struggle with some pretty severe symptoms sometimes. So yeah, I just wanted to say I appreciate the fluidity that Jasmine was talking about.
Thank you, Zoe.
Yeah, I would just agree. I think that it is subjective, and I think we have I know people who overarchingly are perceived by others as neurotypical, but maybe even more than in my experience, they are having to mask who they actually are and the kind of behaviors that are most natural and their most natural way of being. They're doing a level of masking that is really exhausting at a minimum and really like kind of taxing on them. And so yes, they are able to do that successfully to be overarchingly perceived as neurotypical, but that is really, really not their interior experience. And when they are in an environment, an interdependent and caring community environment where they feel like they can let go of that masking, it's an enormous relief to them and gives them more energy for their life in other ways.
Thank you. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. But Debbie, I'd like to invite you to, share any sort of fundamental definitions or thoughts about mental health and how it shows up in this, in restorative practice.
Sure. So, the definition of mental health that I like to use is a WHO definition, and it's sort of this state of well-being that allows people to realize their abilities, work productively, cope with stress, and sort of very importantly, contribute to their communities. And thinking about mental health, just data-wise, there are about 18% of just the general US population has or identifies as having a mental health disorder or has been identified as having a mental health disorder, but in the jail population, it's about 44%, and in prisons, about 37%. So a huge chunk of there's a huge of a representation in the sort of correctional system of mental health disorders. And then thinking about that in relation to thinking about mental health generally in relation to restorative practices, there's quite a lot of overlap in the way that I think about it, because one of the components of mental health is being able to contribute to communities, being able to work productively, And those are very key aspects of restorative practice, being in community and working in community. And so there is quite a lot of overlap just with mental health generally and restorative justice or restorative practices. And it's even more important in this overrepresented population, which is the jail population. So yeah.
Thank you. All right, let's talk about how universal design principles can make restorative justice practices accessible to people, to neurodivergent people and people with mental health issues. And, you know, maybe what's the sort of flip side of that, right? How restorative practices can help build and repair communities, particularly in these spaces. So I don't know who wants to start us off with that. Jasmine, is that something you
Sure.
want to talk about?
About UDL in this framework. So for those of you who are not familiar with the term universal design for learning or universal design principles, it's the concept that that creating conditions that support the learning for one person often supports the learning for all people. And so instead of kind of a framework that's like, okay, you are different, so we're going to give you this specialized learning, but then everybody else gets their learning instruction this way, it's a recognition that not in every instance, but in many instances, what's going to work really well for this person probably will actually improve the learning for all neurotypes, for example. So I'm going to think of an example of this. So for instance, with restorative circle process, we sit in circle and we are going to have maybe 3 questions that are going to go around the circle for either a circle that's related to a specific incident of harm or one that's a community building one. So at Mansfield Hall, very often we are going to share the questions with everybody ahead of time so that they have an opportunity to think about and process those questions before they come into the circle. And that example is something that can, in fact, support anybody or any learner, even if they are not a slow processor or in need of that kind of information ahead. Okay, that's a little about universal design for learning. Because of my learning style, I have to just go back and look at that question written down again. Does anyone want to add anything from the panel about UDL before we talk about the kind of next part a little bit that's about how restorative practices can help build and repair communities of communities who identify as neurodivergent or with mental health issues? Okay.
I think you gave a great description of universal design. Yeah, just this idea that if we make things accessible to the folks who most need it, that uplifts everybody is a pretty important concept.
And I think I'll say another piece with UDL, another way to think about UDL with something like restorative practice is, so at Mansfield Hall, we do 2 kinds of, so we are using restorative practice as a tool to build and strengthen our community. And then when conflicts and harm happen in our community, as a way to repair and then hopefully strengthen relationships and community. So that's a little different than where we're seeing restorative practice be used kind of within or right alongside the criminal justice system. But so for us at Mansfield Hall, sometimes we're doing circle processes with our whole community. I'm right now at our Burlington location, so a circle process for all, 70 of our community members will break up into small circles, and we'll do a number of different UDL practices to support those circle processes. But if we're doing a practice, let's say with just like a circle with just 5 people, we're going to think about who those 5 people are and what might be some of the supports that any one of them might need, and then how that might support everybody. There could be a situation where we decide that the support they need is not to be in the same room together. And so we will conduct the circle in this format on Zoom. Or there will be one where what's going to really help one student regulate is like to bring their big stuffed animal. And so we might say to all of the participants, just so you know, for this circle, if you would like to bring a stuffed animal, you are welcome to do so. So those are just like a couple of examples of UDL. And then just to speak a little bit more from our place to the just the incredible empowerment of bringing the values and the practices of restorative practice and restorative process to a community that largely identifies as disabled and neurodivergent. And the shift from the common framework of you have broken a rule, you have done something wrong, and you have to be punished or disciplined for that, which often within those frameworks becomes a separating of the individual from the community in different kinds of ways, and a kind of whole construct of shame. And so to instead center the communities are messy and complicated, and misunderstandings happen. I will say, I don't know if I would say especially in our community, but certainly in our community, there is a lot of social misunderstandings that can take place and a lot of hurt feelings that can happen. And for us, restorative practice, and I have a partner who works in restorative practice in broader contexts. And so I just see all the ways that these practices, the centering of healing and accountability, means an opportunity for actually building people's social emotional learning capacity while also addressing a very specific situation, a very specific incident, and creating repair. And so that's certainly what we are seeing here is this, so to center restorative practice means that when a student harms or has conflict in a disciplinary framework, as the head of that community, I might just work with that one student who did something wrong and create like an expectation of what they need to do to be back in the good graces of me, for instance, or of the person with authority. But with restorative practice, it's this profound opportunity to not only support that person in their building their capacity to take accountability for their actions and behaviors, but it is an opportunity to also center around the people who were impacted and to go to those people and to check in with them and to see if they were impacted or how they were impacted and what they need to feel whole and safe and supported. And the practice of bringing that conversation to them and seeing what they need and pairing that with the work of the person who did harm is creates these profound protective factors in community. And obviously this is true whether somebody's neurodivergent or not. So what I'm talking about is completely applicable to anybody, but I think for people who experience their sense of self as being marginalized within the broader community, it has that much more power and impact to feel like their needs and their voices are being centered.
I see us all nodding along. I mean, to me, there's a really, I appreciate that you said it's important in your community and your spaces, but not only so, right? It's a very kind of basic meeting people where they are principle. So Adobe, I wonder if you have something that you want to share here, you know, sort of more about the mental health or the context in which you work.
Yeah, so thinking about the latter part of that question, sort of restorative practices and how we use that, and thinking about how that overlaps with how many providers, actually a lot of providers, sort of think about conceptualized care, and there are actually concepts that already exist, like trauma-informed care or recovery-oriented care, that have a lot of overlap with restorative practices. So trauma-informed care, thinking about the whole person and sort of the entirety of their experiences. And when you're engaging with them and making sure that you're not re-traumatizing someone. And so I think restorative practices, you know, that's a huge component of that, is thinking about a person as a whole person. And then in thinking about recovery-oriented care, a huge part of that is utilizing the community and people's supports in providing and sort of helping someone to realize the goals that they've set for themselves. And that again is a huge part of restorative practices, which is sort of leaning on the community to sort of come together to help individuals. And so these are concepts that already exist and a lot of providers already utilize. So just broadly speaking, that's how one of the ways, or two of the ways that I think that those practices or those things sort of overlap. And then specifically in the sort of criminal justice system, I mean, in the restorative justice space, there are like tier 2, tier 3 circles. So thinking about sort of how to repair harm can be really helpful for people's mental health, because again, a huge part of mental health is being in community. And so that just puts people in sort of in a state where they're better able to navigate their mental health, or at least have a higher likelihood of being in that state of well-being when they're sort of in community. And then more importantly, these days, we're doing a lot of sort of even though it's not exactly a tier 3 circle, but a lot of jail diversion stuff has some overlap with re-entry. So doing work where we're preparing people to first diverting people from the jail system or from the carceral system, but then also preparing them to sort of re-enter community. So there is quite a lot of overlap, which is great, I think. And there are many providers who are working with these concepts. So, yeah.
Thank you. I see a couple of questions. Again, some I'm leaving to the end, but if I feel like it's something, and I'm going to bump it to you, Zoe, but I just want to read some of the questions aloud. There's been a lot of discussion about concepts during this webinar. Can someone give a specific example about how restorative justice practices have been effective? So I think Zoe wants to take this on, and then I'll just ask this now and anybody can take it. Can anyone talk a bit more about the distinctions between restorative practices and restorative justice as it relates to this topic, if there are any?
Yeah, I can definitely take that first one. I think it's a pretty large question, that second one about the distinction between our restorative justice and restorative practices. So for me personally, I'm using practices to mean like the actual things we do in order to like pursue justice. So like I'm the most personally familiar with circle process. I do probably like 3 or 4 or 5 circles a week usually. And I do them, like my family uses them. We use them in my community. I also circle keep at a women's reentry facility, which is really a wonderful space to learn from folks in circle. So yeah, to answer the question about examples, I really love circle process as a restorative practice. As an autistic person and someone with ADHD and also severe PTSD, I think circle process is a really fantastic tool, because I can get really easily overwhelmed when conversation is kind of bopping around and everybody's kind of speaking about different things at the same time. And it's hard for me to follow conversations sometimes. So the practice of intentionally slowing down and making sure that there's like a talking piece that gets passed in a predictable order so that I know when my turn is, and I know that I'm going to get a turn and that everybody around me is going to get a turn to speak, that just immediately helps me to access a difficult conversation. So I really love it for that reason. And kind of also with that though, like a big part of ADHD culture includes interruption and kind of building off of each other. So as a facilitator in circle process, it's something that I'm always kind of thinking about balancing of that predictability and structure with also somebody's communication needs to like say something as soon as they think of it so that it doesn't float away. So it's something we are always balancing. And also in circle process, building into the process, opportunities for grounding and mindfulness. So always starting with like reading a poem or like a mindfulness guided meditation, and also closing the circle that way too, kind of helps to center my nervous system. To give another example, I did some circles at a university with their autistic student cohort. And I went out and did a few circle processes around the topic of empowered relationships with these kids. And that was a really interesting experience because we were thinking and talking about like the ways that neurodivergent kids are treated by our culture and by families sometimes also can include a lot of shame and a lot of coercion and kind of like forced obedience is a really common thread, I feel, among neurodivergent youth. And so we were in this circle and we had we had all the students, and then we also had some of their faculty and staff support people in the circle as well. And so it was this really beautiful way for these kids to share about how those things have maybe impacted them going into their relationships as young adults, the things that they carry with them and the way that their traumas impact how they view relationships. And it was a really cool experience because I was there with a colleague, and at the end of it, she's kind of new to restorative justice and circle process. And at the end, she was like, that was a fully formed prevention course. We hit all the marks and we didn't even say hardly anything at all, which was just really cool to see like how circle process like brings out wisdom from folks without it being this top-down educational thing. Also wanted to give another example with circle process and making it accessible. In the transformative justice group that I do circles with, we've started writing each round question on a big piece of paper and passing it around with the talking piece so that that kind of helps folks with memory be able to focus and stay on the question. So that's another example. And I have one more example if folks want it. Adobe, are you unmuting?
Oh, yes, but I didn't mean to interrupt you. You can totally give the example.
Okay, my last example, I promise. So I also I've been a community member in youth diversion circles. And there was this one time that I wanted to share about where there was a teenage autistic boy and he had done some small crime and had been diverted into circle process with us. And his mother was present in the circle as well. And using circle process, we were able to like really get into some of the things that were like triggering for him. And we helped the mother understand that like some situations might be literally overstimulating for her son, and that it was actually okay and important to allow him freedom to leave the situation, to go decompress by himself, And so using that circle process, she was able to come to an understanding about the neurodivergence because we had neurodivergent people in as community members, able to share that information, so that he wouldn't be punished for taking care of himself and meeting his own disability needs first, which made it easier for him to come back later and participate more fully when he had cooled down, instead of being punished for attempting to cool himself down. So we helped give him language to use to ask for breaks. So things like that. We also found out that he has a special interest in history. So we were able to suggest that his family like get a subscription to a documentary streaming service so that he can engage in his special interest as a self-regulation tool.
Thank you, Zoe. And I wanted to sort of speak a little bit to the sort of distinction between restorative justice and restorative practices. And so I think about restorative practices such as the like big picture philosophy of restorative, sort of in the way we think about sort of how do we build community and help each other, to how do we uplift each other and all of that. So that's sort of the sort of big picture science or philosophy of it, and restorative justice more as what we more commonly think about when we think about sort of in the criminal justice system, having the different parties, the harmed party, the party that committed the harm, come together and those sort of things. So it's more sort of a bit sort of the actual more reactive thing that we do, especially when we think about the criminal justice system. So I hope that's helpful. And there was also a question about the sort of concepts versus examples, and I really appreciate Zoe like listing of all these examples. And I'll say that for me, being a psychiatrist, it's I think about the concepts more because I don't always I'm able to have circles in academic settings, in academic spaces, but in my day-to-day practice, I tend to use more of sort of the restorative sort of principles in the way that I interface with patients. And so that's why I in my explanations I may lean towards concepts, but I think in my day-to-day, more as an example, it would be in thinking about people as whole people, thinking about them as sort of the end result of all their experiences, their family, their supports, their community, like the social, like sort of structural and social infrastructure. So thinking about people like in holistically in that way, and what do I then do with that? What do we do with that together is sort of how I think about it. So that's why it's more conceptual for me versus the restorative justice sort of day-to-day practice. Hope that helps. Oh, and then the tier 2, tier 3, they're just a different sort of circle. So we have tier 1 circles that are sort of community building. Tier 2 is sort of when we come together, harm party who committed the harm, community supports, and then tier 3, sort of the re-entry circles. So those are the different tiers of restorative circles. So
Thank you. Jasmine, I don't know if you wanted to add an example or if you're okay to move on either way.
Well, I loved those tiers, how you did. I've never heard it that way, Adobe. I'm going to take that. I love the 3 ways you described that. I will just, I'll say 2 things. One, that the core structure, so we also mostly use circles, and the core structure of circles, as Zoe was speaking to, it is incredibly supportive to our community members, staff, and students for regulating, for making, you know, a lot of our students struggle with understanding what are the social expectations in any given situation. And the circle process creates a really clear expectation of what the social expectations are going to be in this moment and through this process. And that alone, you know, creates the conditions for a really different kind of conversation. And then on top of that, we can add in additional supports like holding the question in your hand or putting it up on the board or telling them before, or a whole host of other things. But actually the core practice is really aligned and supportive. Some of the ways, some of the additional ways that we call at Mansfield Hall, we call it pre-storative is the term that we often use for the ones that are more about community building. So a couple ways that we use Circle at Mansfield Hall is that at the beginning of the year, when all of the students have arrived, we do a whole values circle process, and we as a community build the set of values that our community will be held in for the year. So that then as we unfold in day-to-day life, when things happen and people feel like they aren't aligned with the values that they set, then that sets us up to have a different kind of restorative conversation to bring people back within that set of values that we hold together. We do a similar kind of thing in each apartment for at the start of the year for like apartment meetings and building apartment contracts. There was another example I was going to use of also a kind of we have a whole goal setting process at Mansfield Hall where students are going to kind of set what their goals and direction are for the year. And that begins with a circle. I know that the term circle of support is used in a lot of different kinds of ways, but at Mansfield Hall, that is the student with their team and potentially parents or peers who they want to be with, who they see as their circle of support, going through a guided set of questions about their history, who they are as a learner, what they want, what their dreams are for their life, and what might get in the way of those dreams. And we have this whole process to really hear this kind of learn about and help them learn about themselves as a way to guide goal setting. So we do all that, and then we also use it for more like conflicts and harm circles. Yeah.
Thank you. So while I really enjoy hearing the ways that it supports people, you know, we had talked ahead of time about sharing examples of ways, you know, if you've seen people that you support or advocate for in your roles harmed by a lack of understanding about their neurodivergence or mental health challenges, let's say. And so, you know, I think that's helpful for people to hear as we understand the importance of, you know, the positive practices. And we'll talk a little bit, I see some questions in the Q&A about kind of bringing this a little bit more into the criminal legal system, which we'll do shortly. But so I don't know, I throw that out to Jasmine, Zoe, or Adobe, or all of you.
Miriam, is the question about how we see people in our communities just being harmed in the broader community, like misunderstood or not met as who they are? Or is it sort of specifically when it relates to restorative practice or restorative justice?
I think I had been envisioning it as the first more broadly,
Okay.
but whatever
All right.
makes sense to you to answer, however.
I'm going to think about this for a moment. But yeah.
Okay. Adobe.
Yeah, so I can go. So I think about sort of mental health as such a broad, dynamic, evolving thing. There's so much that we're learning every day. And so I think just maybe giving myself and my another psychiatrist some grace, it's sort of there is so much that even the most well-intentioned, there's so many ways that even the most well-intentioned people can cause harm just because there is so much that we don't know. And that's just at baseline. And so when you think about a place that is as structured as like a jail or some other carceral setting, there's so many rules, and they are designed with the sort of ability level of some of the most advanced, sort of most able, quote unquote, people. So they are not designed to accommodate many nuances. They're very sort of, this is a set of rules for everybody. They're not nuanced at all. And so I think it's easy to see how just easily that like in itself creates harm. Are you too depressed to get up at mealtime? Then sucks for you, you know? Are you paranoid, and schizophrenic, and is someone calling your name? Do you respond? Do you not respond? Are you manic or hypomanic and pacing and restless in your cell? Well, you just have this tiny cell to pace. And so there are just so many ways. And these are sort of the big, broad sort of things that we think about. There are many other like smaller like nuances and ways. Like it's just so easy to be harmed in this system. Are you responding to someone in a way that they don't like or is sort of maybe inappropriate, but out of your control? Then you could sort of get in trouble. And the bigger issue, or one of the bigger issues with the control system, is that when these harms occur and people react in these ways, the consequences are really significant. So you could talk to someone and then be considered sort of verbally aggressive or verbally assaultive and get an extra charge or get an extra. So there are many ways that these harms can sort of snowball into just really, really significant, really terrible consequences. And so it's, I mean, are people nonverbal and able to communicate? And then so that it's just almost too easy. It's a system that is almost set up to, you know, cause harm in some ways, and it's just the inherent nature of the system. So yeah, I could go on and on, but I'll let the others talk.
I appreciate that, and it really resonates with my experience, you know, when I was representing clients with mental health challenges in court cases, and you described a really terrible reality really well.
Yeah, and another thing I would want to mention is even when people are getting diverted or having to be restored to competency, if anyone knows what that means, but that just prolongs the interaction with the mental health, with the court system, with the sort of criminal justice system. I know people will often think about like, this person is just getting off scot-free because they're going to, but no, it actually often can prolong, complicate the whole process because it just sort of pauses it while you go get. So it is just in many ways, some things are where sort of intended to be well-meaning, but still just inherent to the system is just so much harm. So
yeah, and you touched on something that somebody asked about in the chat, and it could be a whole webinar of its own, the question of competence. And you know, it's actually sort of one of my pet peeves, which is sort of how, and from my perspective, how easily or how quickly criminal defense attorneys will raise questions about their client's competence rather than doing, I think, what a lot of the practices and the kinds of things that you've already talked about. Not that you're sitting in a restorative circle with your client, but that you are adapting your communication to meet their needs. You're letting them pace if they need to, you know, all of these sort of ways that we can, as professionals working with people in the system, accommodate the way that we share information and sort of guide people through the process. I think, anyway, it could be a whole other webinar, and I can address that to the questioner later as well. I am looking at time. We have about 15 more minutes before we want to open up to Q&A. So I don't know if Jasmine and Zoe want to, I'm hearing plenty of time.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to contribute one piece. I really want to echo what Adobe said about that, kind of to me speaks to the critical role of education in a restorative framework and culture. That education and kind of like humility. So what Adobe said to the piece, which is there is so much we don't know. So even where we might hold some amount of expertise in what we do, there is still going to be so much we don't know. And so out of that, interactions are going to happen where people are going to feel harm because they're going to feel and be misunderstood, even by those of us attempting a great deal of understanding. And so the importance of our openness and curiosity and willingness to listen and respect that might be the impact that we have. And then also the importance of kind of education at all these different levels. So while my program is not part of the criminal justice system at all, we are interfacing a lot with the college system. And so we are taking a variety of different kinds of opportunities to support and provide education to individuals or groups within that, to help them better support our students. Because even this is obviously, there's a really specific legal idea of what competence is and what incompetence is that gets applied. But in our broader culture, people who show up and are neurodivergent, there is a lot of assumptions made about their competency that are often quite incorrect. And so even for us, a couple of examples of where our students have interacted with the criminal justice system with police. We had a student who went to a pharmacy for a vaccine. The vaccine wasn't available at that moment. This was closer to during the pandemic. And it was overwhelming to the student that they couldn't receive this thing that felt so important to them. And they really had a meltdown. They were yelling, they were on the floor. The pharmacy called the police, which I understand them feeling like we don't know how to handle this situation. But if they'd had somewhat more education ahead, they might have taken a different path. And then the police came, and the police, even though it was, from where I stand, clear this student wasn't trying to hurt anybody and wasn't trying to steal anything, but they were being loud and very unexpected in their behavior. And so then the police restrained the student. And so that was a place where it was really too bad. Some different kinds of education wasn't in place to better support that whole interaction for everybody. We had another situation with a student who was using some very threatening language. It was coming out of intense dysregulation. My assessment was this student wasn't going to harm anybody, but they were using this language, and it resulted in a complex bunch of decisions and steps that we did decide we needed to have a conversation with our local police office about this situation, that it warranted that. And in that case, the police department was able to utilize the education that they do have to connect us to a community street outreach worker at the local mental health agency, the social worker at the police department, and they were able to kind of take this report as information about somebody in their community where they could know that person better, so that if in a future instance this student was dysregulated or making threats, they would know to approach that student, understanding their neurology better in a way that could reduce the chance of harm in that moment.
Can I also give some examples here? Yeah, I think like for me, there's kind of it's both misunderstanding and then also institutional structural discriminations. So like an example of misunderstanding where education would help. When I was doing victim advocacy, I was often accompanying victims to court and witnessing all of that. And so like one example is like if somebody is autistic and stimming and moving their body in a certain way, and somebody doesn't understand that is the way that person's neurology functions. Like for me personally, I can't think if I'm not moving, or like I have some more subtle ones, but some people have ones that if you don't understand what is going on, they often get labeled as aggressive. So that education piece, with permission, of course, is to maybe like let the judge or the attorney know in advance, like, oh, this person is autistic and is going to stim when they're upset, but that doesn't mean that you need to stop the court case or anything. Like, you just need to allow that to happen. So that's an example where education, I think, can be really helpful. But yeah, more than the misunderstanding, it's the systemic ableism that Adobe was talking about a lot, of like really systemic denial of accommodations, denial of even the like opportunity to request accommodations, overrepresentation of disabled people in incarceration, and then also like the effects of laws that a lot of people maybe don't realize that it was literally illegal to be in public as a disabled person in most states until the 1970s. So like, and those laws just kind of morphed into anti-homelessness laws. So those are things that are really like baked into our criminal legal system, is the criminalization of disability, particularly neurodivergence, where somebody is behaving in an unacceptable way. So that's part of it. And I'm thinking also about like near my house, an example where police were involved and EMTs were involved was the Elijah McClain case, and that somebody called the police on him because of the way that he was moving, just walking down the street and not harming anybody, but because he was behaving unusually, the police were involved in that situation. So some other things that I've seen as a victim advocate, there's a lot of denial of due process. So if somebody has a neurodivergence or a disability, they need to receive information in a different way. But if the system is not understanding or proactive about making that information about their case accessible, then that means that they are not actually meeting that level of due process for somebody who might not be understanding the information that's provided to them. And the other really big piece for me that I've seen is with witnesses or survivors of violent crimes being labeled as unreliable witnesses because of their disability, their mental health condition, or their neurodivergence. There's this assumption that everything that they say can't be trusted, instead of making the process accessible for their condition. Yeah, so I'll wrap up there. Those are just some examples.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great segue into our next questions. And I think Adobe and I can handle some of this, and it's related to, there's a couple of questions in the chat, sort of, or the Q&A. Somebody said that they are struggling to translate this information into how it applies to individuals in jail or prison who need the same supports. I'll go back to reminding people about Zoe's definition of the ADA at the beginning. Jails and prisons are covered under Title II of the ADA. You can, anybody who's supporting, whether it's their attorney or some other person in a professional support role, or advise the incarcerated person themselves. And I'm not saying at all, certainly the way, Adobe talked very, clearly about how jails and prisons are not the most welcoming places for this kind of stuff, but they are legally obligated to provide reasonable accommodations. And, reasonableness is something that, can take some time and can be litigated, but, and this is not what we're talking about here, but I've heard of cases where if a person incarcerated has an eating disorder, the jail needs to accommodate that, right? I would think that in Adobe's example of, you're either depressed or maybe medication side effects mean that you're missing the, super early mealtime, means that it needs to be, there do need to be, the jail is required under the ADA to make those accommodations. Some of them are going to be, more complicated than others, I guess. But Adobe, I don't know if you want to speak to other ways I mean, I can also talk about, you know, what attorneys can do, what can happen in courtrooms. Adobe, I don't know if you want to talk about, you know, the spaces that you're in terms of the criminal legal system and how various system actors in the criminal legal system, you know, police, we heard a little bit from Jasmine about that, and Zoe, prosecutors, defense attorneys, courtroom personnel, which include judges, you know, jails and prisons, reentry programs. What are some ways in the next few minutes that we have that those systems can best accommodate the needs of neurodivergent people or with people with psychiatric challenges?
Yeah, and I will say, it's not to sound like an apologist for the criminal justice system, but I think it's a very, at least to me, a very sort of intricate, very complex issue because, like I said, the jail in itself is just inherently not a place to improve your state of well-being. And so providing mental health care is in a place that is not designed to improve your well-being will, I think for me, always be a tension with each other. But having said that, I think there's also such a huge population of folks who have mental health issues that need to be addressed both morally but also legally, like Miriam was just saying. So I think there are a bunch of things that we can do. One of the things is just identifying really early on who needs support and who needs these, identifying people with mental health issues. So doing it from booking or from, you know, very early in the stay so that people don't run into the trouble of getting into trouble and all of that stuff. Also, it just needs to be staffed more. So because you need people to be able to do this identification. So more social work support, more mental health care support, or more provider support in the mental health, in the sort of jail system. Also just more training around what this looks like, both for the staff, so both for judges and custody, about what sort of mental health disorders look like, how they can present, things to do. And then also on the flip side, for providers, more training around the criminal justice system and the control and how sort of being in that system could sort of what the implications are for their futures, and so that you can incorporate that in the planning. So that would be, yeah, and then also just more support that is focused on sort of transitioning back to community, because we're sort of sending people to the jails, traumatizing them a little bit more, and then sending them back out to the same spot that they were in before, but actually kind of worse. So sort of doing things that prepare people for that transition, sort of get them back to baseline, which sometimes baseline before jail was really poor, but then going to jail tends to make it worse because you lose access to a ton of things, insurance, or your disability if you're on it, so a lot of things. And so sort of getting people at least back to, you know, the way they were before they went into the system, but hopefully better. Those are my thoughts.
Can I
you.
add on to one of your points? I appreciate how you're talking about, like, we need more people just to do the work and to do the work well. And I also want to offer kind of a counterpoint to what you were saying about like identifying people with mental health or neurodivergent disabilities. And this comes back to like the wider concept of disability justice for me, where we're trying to build as much autonomy into people's lives and giving them as much control as possible over like they're disclosing their disabilities. So always kind of, and I don't have any experience working like in the institutions other than a reentry program, but like for me, especially with victims where those disabilities or diagnoses will be used against them. So there's always this tension where you want to make sure that whatever like professional role you're in, you're giving as much choice as possible to the person. Like, for example, in custody cases, disability is very, very commonly used as a reason to deny somebody access to their children or custody of their children. And it's very commonly used in an abuser can use that diagnosis against their partner or ex-partner. So there's always kind of that tension where you want to honor somebody's right to privacy of like not having stuff disclosed, because it does kind of increase risk in some ways.
And I appreciate that from the disability justice perspective. I will say that from the, sort of legal system, and certainly when you're operating within the confines of certainly the Americans with Disabilities Act, there is some disclosure that needs to happen to start that accommodations process. It doesn't need to be your whole medical record. It doesn't even need to be a diagnosis necessarily, but it needs to be some, and I always say to people, start as sort of brief as possible about what are the functional limitations and what is the thing that's happening. So for example, I used to ask for closed courtrooms for many of my clients with either significant anxiety disorders or sensory processing. People are going in, and courtrooms are public places. So this is a place where you actually have to balance the rights of the public, right, to go into the courtroom versus closing it so that the participants can actually focus on their case, right? But even if it's not going to be closed, you can have somebody making sure there's not excessive noise. You can adjust where people sit in the courtroom. And there are a lot of, what I call sort of low-level interventions. And that's before you get to, really sort of systems-wide education and processes. And even going back to this, sort of universal design. I mean, honestly, I think a quieter courtroom probably benefits most people. Right? I mean, there's lots of things that will meet the needs of people with mental health issues and neurodivergence that, that can benefit many more people. And even if it doesn't benefit you, certainly won't harm you. So, those are some examples. I mean, Zoe, you talked a little bit about stimming, for attorneys or any people who are meeting with people who are going somehow involved in the criminal legal system, right? Like have a basket of little fidget toys or something, and like Jasmine said with the stuffed animal, you're not going to single out, I know you have a diagnosis, I'm going to give you this fidget toy. You're going to say, these are available for everybody. Feel free to use this thing while we're talking. Feel free to get up and walk around if that helps you, process what we're doing. You have to build in time for breaks. You have to, I mean, these aren't, many of these things are not super complicated and certainly not super expensive. But they're just, again, ways that I think we can meet the needs of people who are going through these systems and hopefully still honoring, what they want to share or not share, and just honoring their lived experience as their whole person. We are about 10 minutes. I've been trying to take some of the questions. Some of them we may need to follow up with at the end, because I would like to see if all of you would like to answer, are there any key takeaways or action steps you hope that attendees will leave with? And I will say, because several people have asked this in the Q&A, I believe Avery's sending out a recording of this webinar next week. The panelists, we've already talked about compiling some articles, PDFs, whatever, things that can be sent out with that. So, to give you a starting place for more information. So we will be doing that as well. Jasmine, do you want to start us off with the sort of one key takeaway or actions, something you hope people will take away or do as a result of this webinar? You need to unmute.
Sorry, I moved my screen, that part of my screen out of view. One key takeaway, just that if the topic of disability and neurodivergence and mental health and how it intersects with restorative justice or the criminal justice. If it's new to you, just that it's exciting that you're here and starting this journey, and that this is just a just one small bite of the immensity of potential learning around this. I see somebody asked about, is it beyond the scope of this webinar to talk about how to de-escalate, for example? Yes, I think it is beyond the scope of this, but there is an abundance of resources around strategies for that. And I will try to identify a couple specifically related to that to share when we share resources.
Zoe or Adobe?
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway that I always want to leave people with is that talking about disability is not like bad or wrong. Our culture has really like enforced this belief through like horrible systemic ableism and eugenics and like all of these historical things. But like we as disability justice activists have been doing so much work for so long to just make it okay and maybe even fun or like positive and exciting to talk about access needs. Like just ask. That's my big takeaway, is that like it's not ever wrong to ask what somebody needs to participate as their most authentic full self. And that's not like wrong or bad. And like, and in my experience working with tons of disabled people, the most common reaction to being asked about their needs is relief. That like, oh my God, you're actually asking, like you actually care. So even if somebody chooses not to disclose in that moment, they know that you care. And if it comes up later, that you're a safe person to ask when it becomes relevant or when they choose to disclose. So just ask.
Yeah, if I can add to that, you know, I've been in situations where either my clients had never been asked that or had never, like they actually didn't know necessarily how to answer that. So then part of it needs to be, you know, you as a professional or a person, you know, a support person working, have some, you know, starting things. Not that that's the exhaustive list of what you know, can try to provide for them or access for them, but, you know, just to sort of prompt people who may never have answered that question before because they were never asked. Adobe?
I think for me, it's just that things are evolving. We're learning new things every day. And so it's okay to not know, to not be sure, because things change every day. And I think to just remain sort of hopeful and curious about things getting better. And yeah, I think that would be it. So just to stay hopeful and to stay curious. Yeah.
Can I add one piece, Miriam? Because I see a question that was
Yeah,
near
to the extent that any of you want to touch on the questions, that would be great. Yep.
Yeah, so just something that was present at the beginning that was from, I think, something I was saying that was like somebody could be perceived as neurotypical, but they're neurodivergent, and what privilege, you know, all those pieces. So again, it's actually a place where, yes, if someone's neurodivergent, they're neurodivergent, however people perceive them. And so back to, you know, we have, at least in some parts of our culture now, we're better about sharing like what pronouns we have. And if there is more places where people can say, not only what do you need in this situation, but can you tell me anything about your neurology that will help me support you? Is there something you want to share about who you are as a learner, that, you know, so that people can in fact self-identify around who they are when they want to and feel safe to better get their needs met. And also just there was a comment that was related to the topic of kind of like what's perceived as neurotypical and in professional environments that connected to class. And while we can't go there right now, I just want to agree that could be a whole nother huge conversation. And absolutely, we live in an ableist culture, but we also live in a classist culture that gives all sorts of privilege to people who can behave in the kind of these like norms, middle class or whatever norms. So just want to acknowledge that.
I have a good quote. I know we're kind of at the end, but about intersectionality and disability justice, if folks would like that. Let me pull it up. Okay, so this quote is by Patty Byrne, who is kind of considered the founder or one of the founders of the disability justice movement, which is really just kind of an extension of disability rights. It's thinking not just from a legal perspective, but from a whole intersectional systems, anti-ableism perspective. And Patty Byrne says, a disability justice framework understands that all bodies are unique and essential. All bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We are powerful, not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. All bodies are confined by the intersections of ability, race, gender, sexuality, class, nation state, religion, and more, and we cannot separate them.
I like that quote. I think we can say, and all minds.
Yes, yeah. Body minds, yeah.
So Avery, what do you think?
What do I think? This was incredible. It's becoming, thank you all again to our panelists. Thank you for taking the time, for your vulnerability, for sharing your resources. It's becoming clear that we need more time on these particular topics. Seems like for me an introductory conversation. Learned so much, and it seems like folks that's in the Q&A and folks that are attending can agree with that. So I appreciate you all for engaging us today. I threw up a slide with some contact information. The panelists gave me permission to share contact information. I will do so again in the recording follow-up email, where I will attach the resources as well as their email addresses and the recording. So you can look for that in about maybe 2 days or so. And I just want to remind folks, like I said, we have kicked off Restorative Justice Month with this webinar, super dynamic. Thank you so much. You've all energized me for what's to come for the rest of the month. Next webinar we have is on November 18th. It's the National Restorative Coaching Program webinar. You'll hear more about some of the coaches that have been involved in that program and just more information regarding how that's going. That's a free and accessible tool that you'll learn about where you can get coaching from folks in your implementation. And then we'll round out the month with November 20th with a follow-up from our newly launched Restorative Justice Laws database. We'll have a conversation on restorative justice and policy, and you'll hear from folks who have had some direct involvement with legislation and the sustainability of that. Thank you all. We are out of time, but I appreciate this time taken. Thank you again for attending, and I'll see you around, and take care, folks.